Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to be your moderator today. I'm Irshad. I'm a teaching staff at Faculty Department of Anthropology of Universitas Brawijaya. And nice to meet you again, Pak Jochem. Last year, you come by to my office. We have a lot of talks about your study, and we really want to learn what the message of these talks. So. Thanks, Bu Fitria, for arranging this talk, and also Pak Sahir and Pak Nanang for supporting this event. Also, Mas Wahyu, thanks for bringing him to us. So we have a Leiden connection here. It's very grateful. So allow me to reintroduce our speaker, Dr. Jochem van Boogert. He is a lecturer at Faculty of Humanities at Leiden University, and whose work engaged critically with the epistemological foundation of Southeast Asian studies, particularly in the context of religion, discourse, and colonial knowledge production. So he's going to talk about, over us a critic commentary about what it truly means to decolonize Southeast Asian studies. So drawing on the case of Japanese Islam with many variations, as we know, like Japanism and mystical Islam and so on. He argues that even the postcolonial scholarship often remains struck with Western epistemological assumption. As we know, many researchers, past and present, presume that every culture must have a religion. I read your paper last night. It's very wonderful. Maybe you can unpack what is the message of the post-coloniality in the Japanese Islam, so back then. So thanks for writing that. And instead of focusing solely on the power of positionality, this lecture encourages us to examine the pre-theoretical notions that have shaped in the field, such as examining ideas that stem from European intellectual history and continue to frame how non-Western culture are interpreted. So this approach invites us to rethink decolonization not only as political or ethical imperative, but also philosophical challenge to revisit and even suspend the category we take for granted for studying culture. So, Pak Jochem, the time is yours.
Thank you. This one? Good morning. Let's push that. Good morning, good morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be back after 1 year and see so many familiar faces. I was also very happy with the introductory talk by Pak Nanak. And if I manage to come back next year I will think about the two dogmas of Quine, and maybe I can respond to him. So, once again, thank you for having me. I would like to present let's say, an extended argument or an extended invitation to think about a particular issue. Unfortunately, next slides. Yes, there we go. And the issue I would like to reflect upon together with you is the issue of decolonization. As you notice, I've put a question mark there. Decolonizing Southeast Asian Studies, question mark. And beyond positionality. Why the question mark? It is an invitation to think along together. I don't claim to have a definitive answer. I will focus on one specific thread, one specific theme, and then maybe we can expand upon that. Maybe we want to go more in depth. It's really up to you. I just came from a conference in Chiang Mai, specifically on the topic of decolonizing Southeast Asian studies. And the organizers were surprised about the number of applications, the number of applications that they received when they launched the call for the Conference on Decolonization of Southeast Asian Studies. They received 250 applications for a talk, which is a lot, and they ended up with 135. And so we had 3 days of people engaging with the topic of decolonizing Southeast Asian studies, which to me goes to show that this is a topic that interests a lot of us, and it also raises a lot of questions. So I will be presenting something that resembles an argument maybe, and I've structured it in the following way. I will first talk a bit about what colonization of Southeast Asian studies usually is understood to be. For that, people usually rely on Edward Said. Then, based upon how we understand the colonization of Southeast Asian studies, we can also make sense of what decolonization should amount to. This is what I will problematize. So I will first show you what we commonly understand to be decolonization, and then I will see if we can look upon it from a different perspective. In order to do that, I will focus on one specific thing. It is the topic that interests me a lot in my own research, which is the idea of syncretist or syncretic religions. And I will focus specifically on that. And I hope to show that this common perspective on colonization and decolonization of Southeast Asian studies, that I think there is a problematic aspect to it, and so I think we should look upon it from a different angle. This I will do by making use of let's say, a different development of the argument of Said. I will use certain quotes from Said's book Orientalism to show you that we can think of Orientalism in a different way, and also about decolonization and decolonization of Southeast Asian studies in a different way. So that's basically how I hope to approach the issue. And now you have a bit of the structure of my talk. So I hope that will make it easy to follow. Okay, so let me start with the colonization of Southeast Asian studies. I think most of you are familiar with Orientalism by Said. The book is from 1978, so it's almost 50 years old now. And it was incredibly important. It has really become the foundation for postcolonial studies. And even though postcolonialism has developed to a level that sometimes it's difficult to trace back how it is derived from Said, I think there's one basic theme in Said that you will always, that in most of postcolonial scholarship re-emerges. And so the basic, let's say, the main theme in Orientalism is that misrepresentations of non-Western cultures, so in this case of Southeast Asian culture, is the result of colonial scholarship. And the colonial scholarship misrepresented Southeast Asian culture because it needed to create what is called an inferior other. So the West needed an other, a Southeast Asian other, which was inferior to itself. So, and that meant that the West could be superior, and it also meant that the West, for example, in the case of Indonesia, that Dutch scholars and Dutch colonial administrators had a good reason to be in Indonesia, because Indonesian people were inferior, so they needed the guidance of Western scholars, of Western colonial administration to get to a higher civilization. So that's sort of the basic argument of Said. This Orientalist knowledge or colonial knowledge serves specific political purposes. So the way we understand Orientalism is actually Orientalist knowledge is politically motivated knowledge, and it has to do with creating this inferior other. Now, that is the main theme of Said, and if you also, especially if you look at how Said wants to solve the issue of Orientalism, then you notice that this is really, let's say, the core of his argument. However, if you read his book, there is some ambiguity as well, because he talks about what we could call a Western lens. He says, well, there's also the Western categories that are responsible for the misrepresentation of non-Western cultures. So there is a bit of, it's not always very clear. So if your main position is that Orientalist knowledge is politically motivated knowledge, and that it's basically a colonial discourse that is responsible for the misrepresentation of non-Western cultures or Southeast Asian cultures, then your solution for the problem of Orientalism should, of course, be to take away those power motivations. And this is exactly what Said does. So in Said's book, Orientalism, he speaks about that kind of scholarship, and he calls it he calls it humanist scholarship, not humanities, but humanists. And humanist scholar is somebody who does not rely upon those political motivations. Is somebody who's only interested in scholarship. Somebody who's only interested in really understanding what these phenomena are in, for example, Indonesian or Thai or Burmese culture. It is also somebody who is aware of their place, their position in the intellectual history of their discipline. So they realize that even though they are doing their research in the 80s or the 90s or maybe today, they realize that somewhere in the past there was a colonial scholarship along the same lines. They are aware of that. They are aware that where they stand with regard to the colonial past. So today, this is Said, but today we would call that the problem of positionality. Positionality expresses this idea that every one of us is somehow situated in a network of power relations. And that network of power relations is defined by race, by gender, by colonial history, by new colonial present actualities, etc., etc. So that network of power relations determines how you see and understand the world. So, resolving the problem of positionality is becoming aware of your positionality, and then somehow you will reach some kind of new knowledge or some kind of new insight. I would say that this is today the dominant way to think about decolonization of Southeast Asian studies. Decolonization of Southeast Asian studies is about focusing on your positionality or the positionality of the scholar, and once you do that, you can overcome the colonization of Southeast Asian studies. Of course, this is the position I will question, and we will critically reflect upon. So I will focus on a tiny issue within the entire field of Southeast Asian studies. So the issue I point out is like very, very small. And it is really the question if this small issue is somehow representative for all of Southeast Asian studies I'm not claiming it is, but we can talk about it. So I would like to focus on religious studies, and then there is a translation of religious studies in Southeast Asian studies, obviously. So religious studies is a field of study that came about in the second half of the 19th century. It is actually the direct result of colonization. So because Europe had its presence in, for example, Southeast Asia for like 150, 200 years around that time, it was starting to collect a lot of information about the cultures in Southeast Asia. And one of the things that this information brought to the scholars in Europe was that there were so many different religions in Southeast Asia. And so the scholars in Europe, because religious studies was really developed in Europe, they wanted to make sense of that data. And they needed to find a way to start comparing these descriptions of all these different religions. How do they match with each other? What's the logic behind it, etc., etc. And so religious studies is the attempt to do this in a scientific way. So theology, Christian theology had existed since the beginning of Christianity, obviously, but now people wanted to do this from a scientific point of view. So it uses history, it uses anthropology, it uses sociology, etc., to discuss and make sense of the religions, in this case in Southeast Asia. And in the field of religious studies, this idea came about that there exists a thing called syncretic religion. And a syncretic religion, and in Southeast Asia, you have many syncretic religions, at least according to religious studies. Now, it is important that we use this word in the way it was intended at that point in time. Today, syncretism it means a lot of things, many different things, and actually it's become a very confusing term. But if you want to use it in a strict way, then syncretism basically it means that you have a religion where there are articles of belief that contradict each other. Syncretism means a religion where people practice beliefs and practices that actually contradict each other. It is different from assimilation. In assimilation, what you have is a religion that has absorbed local practices and beliefs that originally could be contradictory, but it has ensured that these practices and beliefs are now in line with the official teachings of that religion. So assimilation, it means there are no contradictions. The contradictions have been effaced. They have been cleared out. And syncretism is also different from acculturation. Acculturation is actually how a new religion adapts itself to a new cultural environment. And it usually does so by adopting certain cultural features. Best example for me is that for Javanese Catholics, Maria, Mother and Jesus, and also God, when they are depicted like Javanese, like noblemen and rulers, etc., etc. Well, when you go to Europe, they look very, very European. And that's acculturation. So it's quite different from syncretism, as you notice. And then we have the term synthesis, and today people prefer to speak about synthesis because it doesn't want to say that there are contradictions. The problem with the term synthesis is that you now don't really know how the mixture of those different religious elements, etc., how that came about. But I just want to introduce it here so that we are clear that when I speak about syncretism, I really mean the idea that there is a religion where there is a contradiction between certain beliefs and practices. The idea of syncretic religions is very interesting, and that's one of the reasons I study it, because if this exists, it means it must be a super tolerant religion. If you have a syncretic religion, it means it's open for so many different beliefs and practices. It's wonderful, right? So that's why I'm interested in it. And so And that's why I think we should think about it and study it. But one thing we should realize is that if you call certain phenomena, certain things that you observe in cultural reality, if you call them syncretic, then you are not theoretically neutral. Right? If you call something syncretic, it means that you explain it in a certain way. So this is just to set the stage and to make very clear what I will be talking about. Now, over the years, I've of course, as you know, I've looked mostly into syncretism as it has been described with regard to Java. But over the years, I found out that allegedly there is a lot of syncretism in entire Southeast Asia. You can find it in Vietnam, even in the Philippines, in Laos, Burma, Thailand. It's all around. I haven't looked into all of it. So far, I'm really focusing on Java and on Burma. So I will be giving two examples, one from Burma and one from Java. And let me start with Burma. So allegedly, to certain scholars, there is a religion in Burma that we today call Burmese Buddhism, and it is considered to be a mixture of Nat worship and Theravada Buddhism. Nats are considered to be spirits, and they are very capricious. So it's very unpredictable how they will react, but they're very powerful and dangerous. So it's necessary that you placate them. It's necessary that you bring regular offers so that they remain content and that they will also take care of you. Now, the thing is that Nat worship and Theravada Buddhism, they're considered to exclude each other. The idea is that in Theravada Buddhism, the central idea is that you tone down your desires. Your desires need to evaporate. Only then will you be able to get out of the wheel of rebirth. That's the only way for you to reach samsara, or get out of samsara. So desires is something that you should not encourage. You should. But Nat worship is the exact opposite, because in Nat worship you act upon your desires, right? Because you will make offerings to the Nat because you want to obtain something or because you're afraid of something. It actually plays into the desires. So this is where the scholars see a contradiction, and this is where the scholars believe that there is a syncretism. Okay. And the origin of this viewpoint on Burmese Buddhism, this idea that the Burmese are syncretists, it goes back to the colonial period. So the British they first invaded Burma in 1825, I think, and by 1885 they had conquered the entirety of Burma and had made Burma part of the Indian Empire. And there is a very famous author called Richard Carnac Temple. He was a civil servant, but also a writer. He's written many books. And he wrote one very famous book on the 37 nats. So of these nats, there are many different kinds of nats, but there are 37 that are officially recognized and somehow integrated into Theravada Buddhism, the Burmese Theravada Buddhism. And he speaks about what you can see here. He calls the religion, or the Buddhism in Burma, an admixture of Buddhism, Brahmanism, and animism. So mixture, with that he means a syncretist mixture. And then he also says the following: Buddhism in Burma is only a thin veneer of philosophy laid over the main structure of animistic belief. So what he is saying is that the Buddhists of Burma are actually not real Buddhists. They are nominal Buddhists, because in reality they are animists. And then the last thing that I want to point out, he says, well, the fact that their religion is the syncretism and that they're only nominal Buddhists, this fact shows you what kind of level of civilization they have attained. And what he means, of course, is it's a low level of civilization. So this is an Orientalist scholar, and here you can very clearly see that by calling calling Buddhism in Burma a syncretic religion, a nominal religion, you are creating what's called in Orientalism an inferior other. Yeah? And so for Richard Carnac Temple, it was a good thing that the British were in Burma, because then they could help out the poor, uncivilized Burmese. Okay? Now something similar we find in Java. The first person to ever call the Javanese syncretists, at least in writing, was this missionary called Samuel Hartshorne. And Hartshorne, he published his findings on the religion of the Javanese in 1860, so a bit before Richard Carnac Temple. And you should know that he's a missionary, and he is sort of an ethnographer as well. He lived in East Javanese villages and observed the daily life of the Javanese. And based upon his observations, because he wants to find out what the religion of the Javanese is, based upon his observations, he came to the following. So he says, the religion of the Javanese is not an original religious doctrine, not an original system, but the unnatural union of the old religious service with the Indic and Arabic religion and philosophy. The old religious service consists in the worship of nature and the adoration of ghosts, enriched with a couple of ideas from elsewhere. And later on in the same report, he calls this unnatural union, he calls it syncretism. Why is it an unnatural union? It's an unnatural union because these different beliefs actually cannot go together. So for someone like Hartshorne, what he sees is a Javanese person saying that he is a Muslim, which means he can only worship Allah, but also make offerings to Daran Desa, the guardian spirit of the village, or to Devi Shri. For him, that's a contradiction. Okay. And actually, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, Dutch colonial scholarship in Java was for a very long time convinced that Islam in Java was only nominal Islam. The Javanese, according to these colonial accounts, the Javanese sort of only pretended to be Muslim, but in reality they were animists. Yeah? And the typical phrase was, Islam is only a thin varnish over a base of Shivaism and Buddhism. Or, Islam is a garb, that means like a coat through which the half-Hinduized Polynesian heathen still peeks through. Now, I found it incredibly striking that Richard Carnac Temple and Samuel Hartshorne, when they describe the Javanese, use phrases that are so much alike. Right? And they were separated by thousands of miles, and they come from different intellectual traditions, and I don't think that Carnac Temple has ever read the Dutch missionary reports, but they came to similar conclusions. So I found it very interesting. The last thing I want to point out is that, again, calling a specific religion syncretic or calling people syncretic is not theoretically neutral. I think in these examples it's very clear that it is deeply problematic, because it's actually very racist. Calling millions and millions of people syncretic means that they either do not understand what Buddhism is all about, or they don't understand what Islam is all about, right? Which makes them not very smart. Or they do understand what it's all about, but then they pretend to be something that they are not, which would be hypocritical. And to say that about so many millions of people is, I think, from a theoretical point of view, deeply problematic. So, many postcolonial scholars, of course, have picked up on that, and they notice what I also notice, is that this category of syncretic religion is untenable, and it should be resolved. And so what they see is that they recognize this as follows. They recognize it as something that is politically motivated. They consider it a willful imagination, somebody like Nancy Florida, a very famous scholar on Japanese manuscripts, she actually calls all of this a willful imagination, something that's politically motivated, and the only purpose is to create the idea of an inferior Japanese culture or an inferior Burmese culture, and that legitimizes colonial presence. So the solution, from that perspective, the solution would be the Saidian solution. It would be, we have to subvert the power dynamic. We have to take away the power imbalance, and then our knowledge will shift. So again, I bring back to mind this idea of solving the problem of positionality, or the humanist scholarship from Said. It is, we have to be free from power relations, power considerations. We have to focus only on the scholarly or academic interests. We have to be aware of the fact that we are part of a long lineage of scholarship, and historically speaking, begins with colonialism, etc., etc., and we have to charge the hierarchies. Okay, and what's very interesting is that Said knows a scholar of Islam who has accomplished this. Said is convinced that Clifford Geertz is a humanist scholar. Clifford Geertz is somebody who has solved the problem of positionality, because he only really cares about the subjects he studies. And I have here a quote from Orientalism, from Edward Said's Orientalism, and it says, Clifford Geertz is somebody whose interest in Islam is discrete and concrete enough to be animated by the specific societies and problems he studies, and not by the rituals, preconceptions, and doctrines of Orientalism. So I'd say it's rather clear for Edward Said, Clifford Geertz is the postcolonial scholar. Now you're all familiar with Clifford Geertz's book on the religion of Java, and this is how he describes the religion of the Avana, and he calls it a balanced integration of animistic, Hinduistic, and Islamic elements, a basic Javanese syncretism, which is the island's true folk religion. And then on the same page, he contrasts the Agama Abanan with Agama Santri, and he says Agama Abanan is not as pure Islamic as Agama Santri. So what Clifford Geertz is doing is actually doing the same thing as Samuel Hartmann. He is saying that the Abanan, Japanese Muslim, is only a nominal Muslim. His Islam is not pure Islam. And so what you see here is that there is a difference of 100 years between Hartmann and Clifford Geertz. One is a colonial scholar, the other is a post-colonial scholar, at least according to Edward Said, but they say exactly the same thing. By the way, Merle Ricklefs, who published on the mystic synthesis, he actually repeats the Syncretic standpoint, but he does so in 2006. And so, what I would argue at this point is that if Orientalism is all about positionality, post-colonialism is only about solving the problem of positionality, then I would say this is not enough to decolonize this part of Southeast Asian studies, because Clifford Geertz is the post-colonial scholar, but he's saying the same thing. The only difference between Hartmann and Geertz is that Geertz really loves Japanese culture and Japanese people, and he thinks very highly of Japanese culture. And Samuel Hartmann thinks very lowly of Japanese culture. That's the only difference. But the categories are exactly the same, and the consequences of Geertz's explanation, his theoretical point of view, is the same. So that's what I wanted to point out. We see something similar in Burmese studies. This is still something I need to develop, but in the same period when Clifford Geertz was studying Japanese village life, other scholars were studying Burmese village life, and Melfort Spiro is also somebody who's very famous for that. He also speaks about syncretism, and this man, I think John Brome, says the same thing. Also, he also calls it syncretism. So again, he says, and again we shall see that there is a syncretic fusion of Buddhist and non-Buddhist elements, etc., etc. And when he later speaks about it, he really insists that there is a contradiction between this belief in nats and Buddhist beliefs. So just to point out that we see something similar with regard to Burmese studies. So at this point, what I've done is I've briefly talked about what Orientalism means for Said, what decolonization then would mean. Then I've briefly talked about religious studies and what syncretism means. And then I've showed you what descriptions of syncretic religion in Southeast Asia look like, both colonial and post-colonial. So would there be a different way of approaching this issue? Is there a way to look at colonization of Southeast Asian studies that does not rely on the problem of positionality? And I think there is. I think there is a way to do it. And actually you can use Said himself to develop that idea, that thought, that perspective, or that approach. This is the thing. And this is something for you to consider. Orientalism is, in the end, Orientalism is about the way the West has studied Southeast Asia. Orientalism is the way the West has misrepresented Southeast Asia. So Orientalism is typically Western. So our questions should be, what is Western about Orientalism? If we want to decolonize Southeast Asian studies, we need to understand what is Western about the colonization of Southeast Asian studies. And focusing only on the power structures doesn't help you to do that. And it's very easy to realize this because there exists a thing called Occidentalism. It is the way the Orient has looked at the West. And the Orient has also created stereotypes about the West. But then, if that's only about power, you cannot explain what is Occidental about Occidentalism and what is Western about Orientalism. Because you see the phenomenon in two directions. So if you want to find out what is Western about Orientalism, there is a proposal. There is a proposal to do it, to think about Orientalism in a different way. This Balaganga, my guru, so to speak, who has developed this idea. And he uses several quotes from Said to develop this idea. So I'm going to start with a quote that you can find on page 12 in Orientalism. And it's an interesting quote because here Said points to the fact that Orientalism is not just about politics. It is actually first and foremost a cognitive project. And so what it says here is Orientalism is, rather than expresses, a certain will or intention to understand, and in some cases control, manipulate, even to incorporate what is manifestly a different or alternative and novel world. And I think it's a beautiful quote, and it's a very deep insight from Said. And what it says is that Orientalism is really very much about a specific culture, in this case a Western culture, trying to understand a culture that's completely alien to itself, something that's very, very different, and wants to understand it. Also control it, but first understand it. And then there's a second quote. And then so we get, what is this understanding about, right? This is the next step. And this quote will help us. Again, I think a very deep insight from Edward Said. And he says, it's on the very first page, actually, of Orientalism. I shall be calling Orientalism a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. And it's a really powerful quote. And I would like you to focus on three concepts, three terms. The first term is coming to terms. Coming to terms means, it's a bit ambiguous, but it means on the one hand trying to understand, but on the other hand also means be able to deal with. So it has this connotation both of knowledge and maybe a bit of power. And then the other two terms I would like to draw your attention to is deorient and deorient. It mentions the Orient twice. And the first time it mentions the Orient, it actually refers to the Orient in reality. It refers to the cultural reality that the Westerners are trying to understand. It is the phenomena that they see. But the second Orient is not that. The second Orient doesn't exist in reality. The second Orient exists only in the experience of the Westerners. So what Said is saying here is that Orientalism tries to understand Burmese reality, Burmese cultural reality, not by reflecting upon that reality, but by reflecting upon how Westerners experience that reality. So Orientalism tries to present itself as scientific, as objective, but actually it is about how the West experiences it. So it's a very, very nice quote. Now what does it mean to experience something? It's a very, very difficult and deep question. I will try to simplify it as much as possible. Basically, the only way I can handle this is by simplifying it. The way we experience reality is not, there is no such thing as raw experience. Our experience is always structured. Our concepts, our education, etc., they all provide us with a framework that allows us to understand reality, experience reality. And you can compare that to a conceptual framework. So the way we experience our reality is through a conceptual framework. And so what Said does, he sort of points in that direction. He says Orientalism is better grasped as a set of constraints upon and limitations of thought than it is simply as a positive doctrine. So what he's saying here is Orientalism is a framework through which we see, experience the Orient. It is a framework, conceptual, maybe even theoretical framework. And this is the case for all science. All science always works from a theoretical framework. But in the case of Orientalism, that theoretical framework is the experience of Westerners. It is what makes sense to the common sense of Westerners. This is the framework. What does that mean? What does that mean? That this framework makes sense to the common sense of Westerners? Well, in this case, it means that for the West, Java, Burma, it always looks a bit like what they know. It looks a little bit like Amsterdam, or it looks a bit like London, but it's not really the same. So it is like London, but not as good. It is like Amsterdam, but not as good. Which is, if you think about it, a logical way to do it. If you go to a place you've never been before, you compare it to what you already know. And this is exactly what Westerners did. And this is exactly what happens in Orientalism. So the Orient and the Oriental, Arab, Islamic, Indian, Chinese, or whatever, they become repetitious pseudo-incarnations of some great original. And the original can be Christ, can be Europe, can be the West. And they were supposedly imitating that original. And a perfect example, by the way, is Buddhism. If you study the historical way that the study of Buddhism evolved, you see that the Buddha is framed as the Martin Luther of Hinduism. Buddha is a reformer like the Protestant Martin Luther of Catholicism. And this is what Buddha is for Hinduism. To the Westerner, in the second quote, to the Westerner, however, the Oriental was always like some aspect of the West. To some of the German Romantics, for example, Indian religion was essentially an Oriental version of Germano-Christian pantheism. And this you also find is that they're talking about syncretic religions, they always compare it to Greek-Roman syncretism, etc. So, what Said is actually saying is that we should think about Orientalism as a cognitive project. We should think of Orientalism as the way the West has tried to make sense of Southeast Asian cultures. And how did it do so? It did so in a way that made sense to their common sense. It turned it into something that was logical to their experience. And what happens is that, well, Southeast Asian culture becomes something that resembles Western culture, but just not as good. So it doesn't really allow for real fundamental differences. Okay. Well, we can apply that to the study of Burma and Java. And this example of syncretism is a good example of it. Because it starts from the idea, especially in Burma, that the Burmese also have their religion. We don't know what it is. And over time they find out it is Buddhism. And over time they find out, no, it's Burmese Buddhism, and etc., etc. So it's something like they have a religion just like we have in the West, only it's a syncretic religion, meaning it's inferior. Okay. But what we should realize is that this idea of syncretic religion is something that exists in Western experience. It doesn't exist in the reality of Burma. It is something that makes sense on an experiential level, but doesn't mean that it exists in reality. Now, what happens in the colonization of Southeast Asian studies, and this is how Brawijaya thinks about colonization of Southeast Asian studies. What happens is that this story about Javanese culture, about Burmese culture, it becomes part and parcel of the education, also of the Javanese people and also of the Burmese people. And you're all familiar with how the education system in Indonesia developed over time. And it starts with Dutch colonialism, and then it's based upon Western foundations of social sciences and humanities. And all these ideas, all these reflections upon Western experience are in those curricula. And so now the Burmese and Javanese are taught to think about their own culture in a way that makes experientially sense to Westerners, but does not make experientially sense to Javanese or Burmese people. So what this education does, it cuts Burmese and Javanese people off from their own experience. It means that they are no longer able to make sense of the phenomena that they originally were able to do. There's a whole discussion about what this means, which would take a long time to go into. I propose we do it on a different moment, maybe a question on. But colonization of Southeast Asian studies, basically it means that Southeast Asian people are denied access to their own experience, which is absolutely detrimental to cultural translation. If that is what colonization is, then decolonization, decolonization is also a educational or cognitive project. It means that we need to come up with alternative explanations, alternative ways of making sense of those phenomena. And then there are two steps in that. The first step is that we need to become aware of the Western cultural origin of these kinds of stories. Because the story of syncretic religion is just one story. I think there are many more stories like this. But there is a demonstrable Western cultural context, a Western cultural origin And we need to recognize that, and only if we recognize that can we come up with a competitor theory. And the competitor theory needs to do a better job at explaining the phenomena than the theories we have now. And we're almost done. I would just like to show you a tiny bit what this Western cultural origin is about in the case of syncretic religion. And the nice thing is that with regard to Japanese syncretic religion, we can actually really pinpoint it. I hope one day, maybe with regard to Burmese Buddhism, I can also do it. But in the case of Japanese syncretic religion, it is very obvious because we know who was the first person who wrote about it, is Samuel Hartman. He was a missionary, he was a Protestant missionary, and he was also somebody who adhered to a very specific kind of theology, and it's called modern theology. And at that moment in the Netherlands, it was very popular. And Jan Hendrik Scholten, if you want to know, is the guy who developed this first, and Hartman is a follower of Scholten. And so you can go to Scholten, his handbook on modern theology, and there you will find a history of all the world's religions, and then he will explain to you, for anybody who wants to know, what the history of religion in the world is, and where all the different religions in the world come from. And so he starts from, it's a deeply Christian theological story, which I think has a counterpart in Islamic theology. And the basic fundamental idea is that religion is a cultural universal. You pointed it out. This is a deeply, in Christian theology, it's an idea that's deeply embedded. So when God creates the world, he actually gives religion to mankind. And after the deluge, after he kills off the entire world but only saves Noah, Noah is the one who spreads the true religion over the world. So everybody has access to the original religion. Only there's also the devil, and the devil tempts people away from the true religion, and then they fall into false religion. Now that same idea develops over time, and in modern theology that idea has evolved into the following. It starts from the same assumption. It starts from the idea that every culture has its own religion. Every culture has religion. Or differently put, every human has the capacity to religion. And why is this the case? And here he relies on the theology of Schleiermacher, is that every person is able to have what he calls a religious experience. And that's sort of an experience where you feel that you are at a loss, that you feel very tiny, you're overwhelmed by the magnitude of the cosmos, and you need somebody to rely upon. And then the person you will rely upon, or the entity you will rely upon, will be God. And what Scholten believes, like Schleiermacher was a Protestant theologist, is that every human has this capacity to religious experience, but then the way you react upon that religious experience can differ from person to person. And the reaction to that religious experience is different from person to person, but also from culture to culture. So depending upon how highly developed your culture is, your reaction to this religious experience will also be differently expressed, differently developed. So the higher the culture, the more sublime, the more pure that reaction to the religious experience will be. So in poorly developed countries or civilizations, the reaction to religious experience will be people will worship anything, like from a tree to a stone to whatever. In slightly more developed countries, they will worship different gods, polytheism, because the different gods are like the expressions of different natural forces. But then only highly evolved civilizations, they will worship only one God, because they realize that this power that animates the universe is one in essence. Those monotheistic religions obviously are Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And obviously for Scholten, Christianity is best. But this is the framework. And then for Hartman, this is absolutely the case. And Hartman, and the evidence is there when Hartman speaks about the civilization of the Javanese as an explanation for where the syncretism comes from. And basically what he's saying is that the Javanese are very lazy, mentally lazy, is they don't think. And because they're not able to think, they're not evolved enough, and therefore they are syncretic. So, and this is, you see how the theology is the framework, the theoretical framework for where syncretism comes from. And what Giels does is he reproduces that theology, however he does so in a secularized way. That means you don't recognize it as theology, but in the end that's what it is. Okay. I'm at the end, just 2 more slides. I've presented an argument or a reflection, as you wish. I invite you to think with me. Southeast Asian syncretic religion, I argue, is an instance of the colonization of Southeast Asian sites. I think we should be able to agree upon that, especially if you look at Hartwell, Karnak Temple, maybe even Geertz, right? And we should also, I think we should also agree that this doesn't help us to understand Japanese cultural or Burmese cultural reality, because the only thing it does, it says that people are stupid. Answering the problem of positionality, I would argue, does not solve the issue. And the example here is Geertz. But what if we start thinking about syncretic religion as an experiential entity? What if syncretic religion is just something that makes sense to Westerners? From a Western theological perspective, it makes sense to think of syncretic religion. If we do that, then there is a way out of decolonization. Because then what we need to do is realize and really start to map that Western cultural context, that Western cultural origin. Once we know what that origin is, once we know what that network of ideas and concepts is, we can come up with alternatives, true alternatives. And those alternative theories, there are currently a few around, that they're starting to come up. I cannot go into it now, but one of the things is that it really requires us to start asking different kinds of questions. And so far, very often, we still think of culture in terms of, well, basically religion or worldview. And we're still very much concerned, especially when it comes to syncretism, or what we recognize as syncretism, we tend to think about that in terms of religion. I think that this is something we need to start doing and start asking different kinds of questions. That was my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Very interesting explanation of the colonization. So we have half an hour. So I open 3 questions for those who want to address a question or comment. You are welcome. Anybody? So before that, I want to ask a question. As you mentioned that syncretism or Orientalism is a Western perspective. So this is a very basic question. Why Western invest so much energy, money, and resource to study religion in Java? So if I imagine, okay, there is another field that still in the perspective of postcoloniality, I think, Western scholar, especially Dutch, study about hukum adat. How to say hukum adat? Hukum adat, because it has a practical right. So to understand how the local people manage their land, so they can control the land and take advantage, economic advantage. As you said, that it's more it's a political motivation. So why did Western at the time, maybe until today, so eager to know the religion, syncretism. So I think it's more than like academic achievement. What is maybe the political or economical motive? Do we have any answer for that?
Yeah. I will try. Okay. I think the example of Hukumadat is very good because you see the political motivation is very obvious. Yeah. But why this categorization? Yeah. Why Adat? Yeah. And the reason is this: Adat is the other of religion. Yeah? And if you look at colonial literature, if you look at travel literature, etc., colonialists were very much interested in finding out what the local laws were. And their presumption, based upon Christian experience, but also Islamic experience, is that the laws stem from the religion. So if you know the religion, then you know what the laws are. But then they run into trouble, of course, when there is no religious law. So then they come up with Adat law. But then the categories that they use is still religion. Because religion is always considered to be the best way to start understanding a culture. Which again is based upon the idea that every culture has religion. And then we get back to where we started.
Okay. Okay. Any comment? First, thank you for that answer. Okay. Yeah, Mbak.
The question about originality and also truth. It's a very complex thing, I think, because when we talk about originality, what can we? Is there some kind of measure or some kind of like quality to understand about the object being original or not? And for talking about truth, it's a matter of discourse. It's a matter of discourse, a matter of knowledge. If we are talking about cognitive thing, and then we're talking about knowledge and how this knowledge is possessed, how this knowledge is practiced, and also therefore there's this idea of expressions of knowledge, expressions of ideas, and then perhaps I can jump to a very unusual thought about can I say religion is actually practices or forms of ideas in matter of practices that to inform ideas or inform hopes, not exactly being the definition of religion. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were three questions in one, I think. The first one is about originality. I actually speak about origins. Right? And in the case of when we talk about descriptions of Japanese religion, we can find origins. Because all the books are there, all the sources are there, and you can trace it back to the first one. Because at some point, the idea was not there, and at some point the idea was there. And so you know who the first person was, and maybe someday somebody will find somebody who said it 2 years earlier, but it's there. And you know what culture this person came from, etc., etc. And you know what you can reconstruct his conceptual framework or his theological framework. It's just there. So that's how I would answer it. So what other criteria would you need? I would ask. But it would be interesting to compare, for example, that kind of conceptualization with conceptualization, for example, by Islam scholars, right? Like ulama, whatever. What was their perspective on these kinds of practices or these kinds of phenomena, and will there be overlaps or similarities, for example? So that could be very interesting. But when it comes to, let's say, Southeast Asian studies or Japanese studies, it is also very clear that those perspectives played no role. Only now, and since let's say 20, 30 years, are people opening, or Western scholars opening up to other non-Western perspectives. So in the evolution, in the origin, when it comes to the origin of Syncretic Japanese Islam, it's just very clear. When it comes to knowledge, it's if we would like reduce it's a very difficult discussion, but let's say we reduce it to two standpoints. We would say there's one standpoint, and he says, well, we can actually understand some parts of reality, and we can improve upon our understanding of reality, and there is something objective about this knowledge. That would be one position. And there's, like, for example, another position where you'd say, well, knowledge always depends on some kind of power structure, because what we believe today is the truth is just because so many people believe it, or somebody tells us that we should believe it. So knowledge is always power. And there are many, many more positions, but let's keep it simple. Then I think the fact that we are having a discussion, for example, that we try to provide arguments, and we try to give reasons why this explanation is better than the next explanation. Personally, I'm more in favor of the first position. I'm more in favor of the idea that we are able to understand some aspects of reality, and we can argue why a certain understanding is better than that other understanding, and over time we will find out that we were wrong, but this is how knowledge grows. But I also think of knowledge, especially academic knowledge, as something that is limited. Right? It is different from religious knowledge, which is way more absolute. And then the last one, and you should help me out, because there were 3 questions, and the third one was about
expressions of ideas, definition of religion.
As practices.
Yes, practice.
Yeah, religion. Well, you can define religion any way you want to, can you? So you can define anything, but it doesn't change the fact that religion is what it is. I always use in my classes, I use the example of cats and dogs. Yeah? So if I define a cat as a furry, 4-legged animal that goes woof, then it doesn't change anything about dogs. Right? Okay? So for now, that's a discussion on its own. I think that we are able to have clarity on what religion is. I think we're able to do that. But it goes beyond defining what religion is. And so defining religion as practices that inform ideas, for me, is not enough. But it would be a very interesting discussion. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Before a question, I want to add something about Jochem. So you explained that, but I think this discussion should move forward, because I think that the positionality is, about Orientalism is not circulated in the academia circle, because that politics is going everywhere. So currently is the age of media, right? So maybe you have witnesses that tripartite of Kurds is media to any media, so local people can read and reinterpret. So how this, I think this discussion should move forward, how the idea of postcoloniality is not limited to academia, because there is so many Japanese, I would say, neo-Javan reinterpret from the academic text written by European, but it has been distorted in many ways, like YouTube, blogs, and reinterpret the new religion of Japanese, something that it's circulated in academy, but to the public because of the the Western of media. I think I want to add that point. Yeah, and maybe a question, Pak Yusli.
Thank you, Jochem, for the thought-provoking presentation. I got two short questions referring to positionality. So the first is about the difference between postcolonial thought and decolonial thought. What I deduce from your presentation is it true that this is confirmatory that the colonization or the colonial thought is postcolonial thought without embracing or without employing colonial or Western framework? Is it true? Because I read somewhere, especially from Latin America scholars like Ramon Rufus-Quill, they try to detach this decolonial effort from colonial or Western framework. The second is on the theoretical purity. I did my degree on politics and international studies, but also took several courses in Institute of Area Studies, in Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. So what I learned from these two established institutions is that if you study IR and politics, you have to use firm political theories and IR theories. So we stick to, we try to believe that there is a theoretical purity in studying IR and politics. While in studying area studies, like South Asian studies, you don't have to cling into theoretical purity. Is it true? Because there is a hindrance in using alternative theories. For beginner researchers, it is hard to use alternative theories, especially from local alternative theories, which is not established yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very sharp questions. Maybe it's, for me, easiest to start with the second question. This is a personal answer. Because it has to do with my own intellectual, well, but the way I got to where I am now. I studied philosophy as a master, and then when my postmodernism was still very strong then, and basically postmodernism tells you that there is no real truth there. You cannot get to it. The alternative that was offered to us for any kind of theorizing was poetry. Yeah? And Heidegger was like sort of the epitome of philosophical thinking. And I was very disappointed by that, because this postmodernism, it sort of teaches you that whatever you believe, that's okay, and you can argue it any way you want, and you can refer to anybody you like. It just doesn't matter, because there is no real truth out there. So I was very relieved when I ran into somebody like Brawijaya, who was like the real opposite of that, is that no, it is possible to construct a theory and make it scientific, which is believed to be impossible in the humanities, but I've changed my opinion. It is possible to create a scientific hypothesis. It is possible to create a theory that explains something and that you can test, which is one of the definitions of a scientific theory. So if that's what you mean with scientific purity, my personal opinion is that it is possible in humanities, and I think we should strive for that. However, when it comes to humanities, it is for that, in order to do that, we should also become very aware of the Western cultural origins of most of those theories, because otherwise we run the risk of formulating a theory that is not a proper alternative, because it will keep on relying on Western common sense notions, and so when you get them to post-colonial thought, I haven't read much Latin American thinkers. I've read some South Asian post-colonial thinkers. So I'm not 100% sure what you are referring to. what I notice is that what I've read so far, I found it incredibly difficult to understand. And the reason is that they use a kind of jargon that is impenetrable. It is very difficult to make sense of. And it seems to me that this is done on purpose, because they're trying to avoid the categories, the Western colonial categories. So they try to come up with different kinds of categories, which cannot be binary, because for some reason binaries are bad. They cannot be about hierarchy, because some hierarchy is bad, and etc., etc. And the result for me is that this is only something that works for people who are part of the jargon, but it's not accessible. And I've noticed it in the few Latin American thinkers I've read, and I especially noticed it in South Asian thinkers, like Homi K. Baba, for example, or Abadurai. It borders on the unintelligible. And I think that if we want to come up with an alternative way of making sense, we should try to make sense. So I personally, I'm more in favor of, I believe that scientific theories in humanities are possible, and I think that in our effort to create those, we should use as little jargon as possible. I don't, does that answer, is that a good reaction to your question?
Should you elaborate deeper about how to make alternative theories scientific?
Well, it's about testability. I can give an example about testability. In the case of Said, for example, you can think about Said's hypothesis in a way that makes it testable. But Said has never done it, okay? So if Said is right, that the colonial discourse creates the misrepresentation of Southeast Asian cultures, then you should not find the misrepresentations before colonialism. Okay? The funny thing is that you actually find the misrepresentations before colonialism. So this is a way to make something scientific. This would be a very long story, but I believe we have a scientific hypothesis on religion, and it would make the scientificity lies in the fact that it allows you to solve many more problems than we are currently able to do. So if you have one hypothesis that is able to explain many different, or solve many different problems, explain many different things, we consider that, scientifically speaking, to be a better hypothesis than a hypothesis that explains only one thing. So today our theories on religion, the most dominant ones on religion, they explain one thing. Why people have religion, for example. But it's very difficult to explain differences between religion, etc., etc. A scientific hypothesis of religion would allow you to explain way more things than just one. So those are just two examples of how hypothesis in the humanities could be scientific. A, making it testable, and B, seeing how much it is able to explain.
Okay, the first question. Okay. No, the first question he didn't answer yet. The difference between postcolonial and decolonial.
Repeat the first question, Mr.
Oh, I'm sorry. What it is today, the difference between postcolonial and colonial thought, as far as I can understand, it is a subversion of power hierarchies. It tries to subvert the hierarchies that were held responsible for the original misrepresentation. I think that postcolonialism today consists mostly in that. So one of the things to do that is to destroy. To destroy what we have, to destroy it. And then it is usually replaced by either another hierarchy, but then that's the morally right hierarchy, considered to be morally right, or it is it uses categories that are so fluid that it becomes, illogical. That I would say. Also, I see much postcolonial thought, for example, subcultural studies. The only difference here is that the focus of its, for example, subaltern history, the focus of its history is different. But its idea what history is and what history does is the same as colonial history. It uses the same kind of methods, the same kind of categories. Its focus is only, it shifts away from dominant ethnic groups, for example, to marginalized ethnic groups. That's the only thing it does. So then there is no real difference, as far as I'm concerned, between colonial and post-colonial scholarship, because conceptually it's the same.
Another mistake? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we still have time, so feel free to address a question. Silakan.
Okay, so thank you. As I listen to Dr. Jochem's explanations, it mentions that when we talk about decolonizations beyond positionality, we also look at how Western experience the Eastern itself, right? And it means that there is a binary between Western experience and Eastern experience, right? So, does it mean that the decolonizations have to focus on the binary, or would it be possible, like Homi Baba concepts in third space, that both sides may have negotiated this knowledge to be produced, and because the other concept from Bruno Latour mentioned also that basically what is that? There are many actors that may produce the knowledge, and it will help to understand the whole concept of the culture, right? So, that's my questions. Is it possible to actually look at the knowledge produced related to the Japanese Syncretic region on the third space, looking at the negotiated conditions from the experience of the Western and Eastern? Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice question. I think that a suitable answer would have to do with what colonial consciousness is about. And my understanding of what Homi K. Baba describes as this third space, I think it's maybe better understood in terms of colonial consciousness. I haven't really gone into it in this presentation, but if you start to think about colonization of thought along these lines, what happens is that the colonized is using the colonizer's categories to try to make sense of their own experience. However, this is not possible because the colonizer's categories make sense of Western experience, not of Javanese, Southeast Asian, or whatever experience. So the third space where there is some negotiation going on, as far as I'm concerned, there is no real negotiation. Because it's in the end, it's the adoption of categories that distort the experience of the colonized. And what happens in the third space is that these categories are being adopted. So it does not lead into decolonization. It actually, in a way, it makes it worse, because it makes it seem like there's decolonization going on, but actually there isn't. Experience is about learning, and experience, the way we learn and the way we teach, it differs very much from culture to culture. Different cultures teach and learn in different ways, and so there's always a cultural element to the structure of your experience, and so this is why the problem of translatability, for example, has a lot to do with that. Yeah? So this is why it's not as straightforward as that. Also, when it comes to, I don't think that the issue of binaries is very important. There's so much focus on binaries, I have difficulty understanding it. I think it comes from the fact that basically Said speaks about the West and then the other, and that's the binary. And then the problem, the solution is that we should think of, instead of 2, 3, or 4 cap. I don't think that's really the problem, because the problem is the way the other has been conceptualized. It's not the fact that there is an other, it is that the way the other has been conceptualized, and the way the other has been conceptualized is as a variant of the first. That's the real issue. So whether it's a binary, a trichotomy, or whatever, how many distinctions, it is on what basis are the distinctions being made?
Yeah, as you mentioned on your paper, is syncretism, or as well as I think Orientalism, is what irreconcilable. Irreconcilable, two things that cannot be reconciled, right? Yeah, that's maybe that's the point. Yeah, that's syncretism. And I think it's also occurred in the production of knowledge, right? Is things that help me to pronounce this. Irreconcilable. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, tidak bisa direkonsiliasi. Okay, thank you. Maybe the last question, Mas Iwan? Oh, okay. Maybe, yeah. Two last question. We still have time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jochem, for your presentation. And I want to start my question with a little story about my life. Because I was raised by Catholic family. As long as I remember, my grandfather was converted from, I don't know, to Christianity. And when I was a child, I think I saw a lot of stuff and practices that very interesting for me. For instance, when we pray, we pray in front of cross, or maybe Jesus picture, and maybe Mother Mary statue, and in front of the stuff we put the incense, and we pray to the for someone who passed away after 40 days, 100 days, and 1,000 days. And I think it was a syncretic religion, in my opinion. Catholic is a part of this syncretic phenomenon. My question is, from the perspective of decolonizing the religion understanding, why Japanese make this phenomenon? I think blending the religion and practices which contradict. And is it a Japanese way to smoothly or minimize the risk or conflict to converting to the new religions? And yeah, I want to understand about how my grandfather do that, and maybe he just trying to minimize the conflict between himself and others to smoothly convert to the Christianity. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. I think what you are describing is an example of acculturation, and depending on the theology involved, maybe even assimilation. And especially Catholicism is very well known for being very open to local cultural and even other religious practices. It absorbs them and it makes them part of their Catholic practice in that specific region. So having these prayers for deceased or on these very same moments where maybe in the past people would have held a psalter, that would be like a very typical Catholic strategy to convert people to Catholicism. At least from what I know and what I've read, I recognize it as such. But I could be wrong, but that's how I recognize it. And it makes it for, I'm sure that made it for Japanese people easier to accept Catholicism than, for example, Protestantism, because in most Protestant missionaries were very strict and they would not have allowed it. But Catholicism would allow it.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe one additional information. I observe current practice of Japanese religion, Kejawen. They not all. I think it's more than assimilation, acculturation, synthesis. For example, of course, they idolizing like Danyang or their ancestor, and including Prophet Muhammad. But there is one phenomenal figure which some of adherent idols is Sukarno. Sukarno is everywhere. He's like become like a spiritual phenomenon for Japanese people right now, including my father.
If I can just pick up, this is super interesting, and this is a phenomenon or a phenomena that we should start studying with competitive theory. This is what I believe. And then, but the issue already starts with how we describe it. Because when you speak about idolize, you should know that when in the 17th century, a Western merchant came to Southeast Asia and he saw the religion of the locals, what he described was he saw an idol and people were worshipping the idol. And an idol is a false god. So in a way what you're saying is that they're worshipping a false god, and then you are reproducing the colonial categories.
Maybe worship.
Also a problem.
Okay.
No, just to show you how big the problem is.
Yeah.
Because what words will we use to describe what we see?
Yeah. Thank you. Pak Ari, maybe your last question.
Okay, Jochem, thank you. It's very fantastic explanation about syncretism. But I wonder about the theoretical concept of decolonization, because many of my friends, I came from also CRCS, maybe you know, Center for Religious and Cultural Studies also. This is my past studies, it's boring, but it's intriguing actually. The decolonizations, what is the object? Based on your working papers, I read some of it, and my working also, but that is based on the text. So this is a very convenience actually, because if we're using anthropology, ethnography, this is a question I'll tell you about my PowerPoint, which Japanese, for example, you are talking about, and whose Japanese we are talking. So this is different situation, different context about decolonization. So what is the object of, is it for the object is the text and we are as academicians, or else? Because it's difficult to unfold from the society, especially the father-in-law of myself, or myself, because I'm also part of one of the movement of Kejawen. So, decolonization is very difficult from the point of view the praxis rather than the textual. Are we as academicians rating the text from the
practical people there, or the academician who make that happen became the text. So we can read in the Google Scholars, about this, about that, then we take colonialism there. Because the impacts, this is the long view about the decolonization. Orientalism, Occidentalism is becoming what view? It's positional. They have position. It's also colonialist, us. Oh, I'm Orientalist, oh, I'm Occidentalist. Occidentalists mostly came from the Muslim academicians. Orientalism, especially from the Christians academicians. So what happened with this decolonization project? It's a committee project also, isn't it? Or else, I don't know. Because this is so we rather moving from the Orientalism and Occidentalism, we create the third space as we discussed. Yeah, I don't know how to formulate this. So what is the object of this decolonization, especially for the theology studies or religious studies? Because before we talking about that, the reality of the context in Indonesia especially, we have difficulty in my research. What is religions? We have the dictions of agama, budaya, kemudian macam-macam itu. Yeah. This is a very colonialist concept actually, because culture without spirituality, quote unquote, just like a religion actually. Culture is religions actually, but because of the.
If there's one thing, I've learned many things from Bala Gangadhara, but if there's one thing I've learned from him is that the West should start taking serious other cultures, because the West can also learn from other cultures. But so far this is not the case, because the West is also always the model in which the other cultures have been reflected, so to speak. I think you get my point.
Yeah, thank you. We can talk later.
Yeah, we can continue after this talk. So that's our question, the last of this talks also. Jochem, thank you very much for insightful presentation. And I will say thank you for audience for joining the session. And we have another session, right? Organized by LIH. Okay, that's all. Terima kasih semuanya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for the moderator, Bapak Irsyad Matias, and also Dr. Jochem for presenting us with meaningful insight on decolonizations of Southeast Asian studies. Ladies and gentlemen, this session concludes our sharing sessions today. On behalf of the Humanities Science Laboratory, we extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Jochem van der Boogert for the valuable insight and reflection shared in these sessions. Our appreciation also goes to all the participants for your active engagement and thoughtful questions. We hope today's session has sparked deeper reflections on what it truly means to decolonize Southeast Asian studies, especially when we begin to center perspective rooted in syncretic tradition, indigenous agency, and live realities beyond academic borders. Thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in our next sessions. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, well done.